Hello you guys, welcome back to my channel for those of you who are returning. If you are new here visiting for the first time, thank you so much for stopping by. I'm Anita with Anita by Design, and here on my YouTube channel you will find step-by-step, very detailed sew-alongs, tutorials, and pattern reviews to help you with your sewing projects. Today I have a sew along for you. We're going to be sewing Simplicity 8505, which is a 1970s vintage caftan. I absolutely love it. It is super comfortable. And if you missed the pattern review video that I posted last week or a few days ago, then make sure you go check that out because I give you all of the details about the pattern. I tell you about the supplies that we're going to be using. So you will go check that out first and then come back here and I'm going to walk you through the process of sewing the caftan. This is beginner friendly, but I'm going to say advanced beginner friendly because there is one part where we insert the yoke and the midriff that can be a little tricky for brand new beginners. Now, while I'm going to be walking you through the process and showing you how to sew that on, you really should have some experience with sewing in order to complete that part. And I do suggest everyone watch the video all the way through before jumping in and sewing along. Of course, if you have a lot of experience, then you can just go for it. But for my beginners, you know I love you. My beginners, watch the video from beginning to end to see what all of the steps are and then go ahead and jump in. Now, I do want to let you know that I will not be inserting a zipper or not a zipper. I will not be inserting the button that the pattern calls for. I'm sewing view B and it calls for a button and then a thread loop to close the button. I'm not going to do that because it's not necessary. I'm sewing the back closed all the way up and it fits over my head easily, no problems. Okay, so just wanted to let you know that, yeah, I think that's about it. So let's get into the sew along. Okay, before we cut the fabric, we need to attach the extension pieces for the front and the back to extend the length of the dress. So we're looking at piece number 5 here, and you'll notice there's a little attention grabber. This box tells you that you need to join these pieces together before cutting the fabric, and it gives you a little diagram on how to do it. So this is piece number 5, the front, and then this is piece 5A, the extension. So we have these markers on the front and the extension, and we're going to use these markers to match up the two pattern pieces together. So using the extension piece, we're going to place it on top of the front piece, and you'll be able to see the markers underneath. So we're just going to line those up evenly, all 4. And I'm going to use pattern weights to keep it in place to make sure it doesn't shift before I tape. So all the way across, make sure that they are perfectly even. Oops, I shifted a little bit. Okay. Now, after you have everything lined up perfectly, you can use tape to tape right across the top. And I'm using magic tape because magic tape is easy to remove just in case you make a mistake, a pattern piece shifts and you have to remove the tape. Then this tape is easier to remove. Okay? Now, you can turn it over on the other side and pin along the bottom if you like. I prefer to do that just so that this isn't flapping around while I'm placing the pattern on the fabric and cutting. Okay, now our pattern piece, the front, is ready to be cut out with our fabric. Make sure you do the same thing to your back piece, 8 and 8A. After you have prepared your pattern pieces, you're now ready to cut your fabric. Make sure that you follow the cutting diagram according to your size and the width of your fabric. You also want to make sure that you pre-treat your fabric before cutting. Okay, we're going to start with our back facings. Go ahead and apply your interfacing to the back of your fabric. You can see that my fabric frays a lot. You see the threads hanging off. So what I've done is I've serged the curved edge of my facing just to make sure that it doesn't fray any further. And then I fold it over 1/4 of an inch and sewed it down so that I have a nice clean finish on the right side. If your fabric frays a lot and you don't have a serger, you can just fold over the 1/4 of an inch, sew it down, and then you can take your fray check and just squeeze a little bit around the raw edge to prevent it from fraying any further. Okay, after you have applied or prepared your facings, then you're going to make sure that your ties are ready. The instructions call for 1 3/4 yard of 1/2 inch wide twill tape, hem tape, or ribbon. You can use whatever you choose. I had hem tape, so that's what I'm using. Or you can prepare your own self ties using the same fabric that you're using to sew your dress. Before we start putting the dress together, we need to reinforce our neckline, starting with the front. So this is the front where the square is on the neckline. Here, we're going to use our seam gauge and we're going to measure down from this corner 1 inch. And I'm going to pin in that spot. And then in the opposite direction, 1 inch. Add a pin there. Then we have a dot here. This is at the 5/8 inch seam line. We need to come up 1/2 an inch because when we sew this stay stitching here, we're going to sew it 1/2 an inch from the raw edge. So I want to make sure that we have a stopping point. So I'm going to mark up or measure up 1/2 an inch from that corner. And then I'm going to use a pencil, or you can use a marking tool, and just mark a dot right there so that I know that's the stopping point. So we're going to add a stay stitch, which is a regular 2.5 length stitch, 1/2 an inch from the raw edge. So I'm going to start at this pin, sew over to the dot, pivot, and then sew over to the next pin. Okay, starting where the first pin was inserted, I have the fabric inserted at the 1/2 inch seam line, and we're just going to sew from here all the way down to the dot that we marked. After you reach the dot, you're going to leave your needle down in your fabric, lift your presser foot, and then pivot your fabric. Turn it to where making sure that you're still on the 1/2 inch seam line. Lower your presser foot and then sew down to the next pin. And you don't need to backstitch. This is just a row of stitching to prevent this corner from stretching. And you're sewing at a 2.5 stitch length. Make sure that you do the same thing to the other side. After you reinforce your front edge, you want to do the same thing for your back neck edge. But on the back, you want to sew from the shoulder seam all the way over to the center back seam, 1/2 an inch from the raw edge. Okay, after we are done reinforcing the front, we're going to go ahead and sew in the center front seam. So we're looking at our center front, and we're going to find the double notch that's right here, and we're going to pin that together. I'm going to go up to the top and pin, and then continue pinning all the way down using however many pins you need to help keep control as you're sewing. So pin all the way down to the bottom where the hem is, and then we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew from the bottom hem all the way up to the top. When you reach the end, go ahead and do a back stitch, And then you are going to go to the pressing station, and you want to, actually you can finish off your raw edges first. I serged mine because that's just the method I'm using. Use whichever method you choose to finish off your raw edges. Then go to the pressing station and press your seam allowances to one side. Next, we're going to attach the ties with a basting stitch. You see that there's a little dot there that you should have transferred onto your fabric from the tissue paper. You're going to take your tie and line it up with the raw edge and pin it into place. Okay, you want to make sure you do that on both sides, and we're going to insert a basting stitch right across the tie. Okay, after we have attached our ties, we're going to go in and clip the corners up to the dots. So taking your scissors, we're going to clip from this corner up to the dot, not going through the dart, on both sides. Okay, and after we've done that, we're going to go to the sewing machine and add 2 rows of basting stitches right along the straight edge here. So from one corner all the way over to the other, you're going to go in 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge, sew in a basting stitch, and then you're going to come into the seam allowance 1/4 inch away from the first basting stitch and then insert another row. So let's go do that. Okay, I'm going to insert my fabric. You see this is where I've made the diagonal stitch, so I'm going to insert it right along the straight edge. And starting at the just past that corner, we're going to insert a basting stitch all the way down at the 5/8 inch seam allowance. Make sure you do not back stitch. Okay, then you're going to lift your needle and your presser foot and make sure that you pull a length of thread to make sure that you have something to pull when you're gathering. Okay, we're going to go back in, insert the fabric again, and this time we're going to sew at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Again, lift your needle and your presser foot, and then leave a length of thread so that you have 2 rows of basting stitches. Okay, now we're going to prepare the yokes for the front of the dress. You have an extension right along the center front. What you're going to do is you're going to fold over 1/4 of an inch on this extension and sew that down. So what I did is I pressed it over first because my fabric is really thin. So I pressed over 1/4 of an inch and then just sewed that down. After you've done that, you're going to do the same thing that you did for the front of your dress. Is you're going to insert 2 rows of basting stitches. Okay, after we have prepared our edge and sewn in our basting stitches, we're going to sew the 2 front yokes together. So we're looking at one yoke piece with the right side facing up. We're going to take the other with the right side facing down. And we're going to pin this together, starting where the notches are. And we're going to pin right up to where the mark is. You should have transferred a mark onto your fabric from your tissue, your pattern tissue. And I'm going to pin perpendicular right there so I'll know where to stop. But if you have your mark there, you should be able to see where to stop. And then we're going to go to the sewing machine and sew a stitch from the bottom all the way up to this dot, beginning and ending with the back stitch. Okay, this is what our yoke looks like after it's been sewn and pressed with the extensions pressed over. So we're going to turn it over to the right side. And that's what it will look like on the front of the dress. We're going to take our midriff and we're going to pin it to the bottom. So let me turn this way. And we're going to start at the center on the yoke. So I have folded my midriff in half to find the center point. So with the right sides facing each other. So I'm going to line up, move my threads out of the way. I'm going to line up my center front on the midriff with the center front on the dress or on the yoke and pin that into place. Then I'm going to go over to my notches and match the notches. On both sides. And then I'm going to go and pull up. You can see that the yoke is a lot longer than the midriff. It's supposed to be that way because we're going to pull up the thread to gather. So I'm going to turn over and I'm going to pull the thread from one side and just gather the fabric. And then I'm going to pull from the opposite side to gather on this side. Okay, and we're going to gather it up just enough to fit the yoke. Okay, where is my thread? Let's gather this up a little bit more. And then you want to make sure that you distribute the gathers, and you can do that just by using your finger to just spread the gathers out evenly on the yoke. And once you have it to your liking, I'm going to spend some more time working with that, but I'm not going to do it on camera. So once you have it to your liking, just go ahead and pin into place. And then you're going to make sure this is gathered. I'm not doing it because I'm trying to not spend too much time on camera doing this. So make sure that you do that on both sides. And then we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew our seam all the way from one end to the other. Okay, now I have all of my gathers distributed across the yoke. And next we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to just sew a 5/8 inch stitch right across the bottom. And you can start by sewing a basting stitch. I'm going to skip that step just to save time on the video, but you can actually do that to have more control when you sew in your regular stitch. If you are following along with the pattern instructions, I want to bring to your attention that in step number 4, which is this step, at the bottom, the last instruction says the remaining yoke section will be used as a facing. That's a typo. They meant to say the remaining midriff section. We have the midriff and then we have a facing piece for the midriff. We do not have a facing for the yoke, so I don't want you to get tripped up over that. Okay, so let's go to the sewing machine. Okay, I have my fabric inserted under the presser foot and I'm sewing with the gathered side facing up. Make sure that my gathers are not becoming pleats. Okay, now that we have the yoke attached to the midriff, you're going to go to your pressing station and you're going to press Let me open this out. If you're going to press the seam allowance toward the midriff. Okay, next we're going to attach the yoke and midriff to the front of the dress. So we're looking at the front of the dress with the right side facing up, and this is the center front seam. So we're going to take our midriff and yoke, and I've already pressed the seam allowance toward the midriff. And I have located the center front on the midriff by lining up a pin with that center front seam. And you can do that just by folding it in half and then inserting a pin on the edge. So we're going to make sure that that center front seam on the yoke is lined up with the center front seam on the front of the dress. You wouldn't want that to be off. It would look kind of strange. Okay, first we're going to pin there, making sure that that's centered. Then we're going to go over to the side, and we have a notch on the end of the midriff, and we're going to match that to the notch on the dress. And the same thing on the other side. Now, keep in mind, if you're matching up the notches, the midriff is going to hang over the seam on the dress. So these edges are not going to line up. Remember, we cut in a notch, a slit there, so it's supposed to hang over. Okay, now we're going to turn it over to where our front is exposed, and we're going to use the basting stitches, the 2 rows of basting stitches that we inserted, to pull up the threads and gather the dress so that it fits into or onto the midriff. And this is the same thing we did with when attaching the midriff to the yoke. Same thing. So just pull and gather until the dress fits onto the midriff, and just use your fingers to distribute the gathers evenly until you get it to your liking. Go ahead and pin the dress onto the midriff. And then I'll show you how we're going to pin the rest over on the side. So I'm going to let me turn this around so that you can see the side. Okay. So here we have the midriff pinned. Now we have to pin this side, the side of the yoke, to this side of the front. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the midriff. Let me make sure you can see that. I'm going to take the midriff or the yoke, and I'm going to turn it so that it matches the side of that front opening. So I have double notches on the midriff. I'm going to look for, or on the yoke, I'm going to look for the double notches on the front of the dress and match that together. And pin. And I'm going to go up to the top and pin. Okay, and continue pinning. And I'm going to go down and pin. Okay, I need to bring your attention to the corner before we go to the sewing machine, because this is very important. This can be a very tricky area to sew when we're pivoting. So what is most important is that the fabric, the dress, is far enough up on the corner to where you're going to have 5/8 of an inch on both sides when we're sewing. So here's what you're going to do. When you get ready to pin the dress onto the midriff, make sure that you pull the dress up enough to where you're going to have 5/8 of an inch on both sides. So what you can do, this is what I usually do. Take your seam gauge and move it over to the 5/8 inch mark and measure from the edge all the way down to 5/8 of an inch. If you hit the fabric on the dress at 5/8 of an inch on that side, and then you'll measure over on the other side. If the 5/8 inch mark hits the fabric, then you're safe. If not, if this falls short, the dress, then you're going to be sewing on one layer only, which would be the midriff. You need to make sure that you're sewing both layers, or else you'll have an opening, you'll have a hole in the dress. So make sure that you measure over 5/8 of an inch to hit the dress and the midriff. Okay, now we're going to go to the sewing machine. I have inserted my fabric starting on the side, and then I'm going to sew down to the gathers to pivot. Make sure that you keep your edges lined up evenly. Okay, so I am coming up on the dot, so I'm going to make sure that my tie is straight. Okay, so here is my dot, and it looks like as I sew down, the needle is going to hit that dot on this side. So I'm going to make sure that my fabric is straight, and then I'm not sewing in any folds, and continue down to that dot. Okay, leaving your needle in the fabric, lift your presser foot, and then we're going to pivot . So pivot, turning your fabric in the other direction, and we're going to sew along the side with the gathers. Making sure that you're at that dot, that your fabric, that you're hitting the fabric, and mine was lined up. I pinned it ahead of time. And then you'll just continue down to the other side and do the same thing, same process to pivot, and then sew up the side and end with a back stitch. Now that we have the yoke and midriff attached to the front of the dress, this is what it looks like on the wrong side. Next, we're going to attach the facing, the midriff facing, to hide all of the seam allowances. So I have prepared the midriff facing by pressing over 5/8 of an inch to the wrong side all the way around the facing. Then I'm going to take it and place it with the wrong sides facing down, and then we're going to go around and we're going to pin this into place, covering the seam allowances. So you will pin that all the way around, and then you're going to take your hand needle and thread and just slip stitch all the way around. Okay, I want to bring your attention to something that I forgot to do since I am sewing up the seam at the center back on the dress. I actually should have sewn the center seam on the facing before sewing up the 1/4 inch seam, but since I didn't, I'm just going to go ahead and sew that up right now. So placing the facings with the right sides facing each other, I'm going to pin that, and then I'm going to sew a 5/8 inch seam just to close up the back so that when we're ready to attach it to the back of the dress, it'll be ready. Okay, then go to your pressing station and you're going to open this out and press it flat. Now we're going to sew the back pieces together at the center back. I'm starting at the bottom near the hem, sewing a 5/8 inch seam allowance and beginning with a back stitch. I'm going to sew all the way from the bottom up to the top of the neckline without stopping because I'm closing up the entire back. I'm going to back stitch after I reach the top. Then I'm going to finish off the raw edges and go to the pressing station and press my seam allowance to one side. Okay, I have pinned the facing onto the neckline on the back of the dress, and we're just going to go and sew that down using a 5/8 inch stitch or seam allowance. And when I'm sewing on a curve, I make sure that I sew nice and slow. Okay. Now you're going to take your scissors and trim off about half of seam allowance. Then you're going to go to your pressing station and you're going to press it over. And you're going to press your seams toward the facing. And then we're going to come back and we're going to do an understitch. Okay, now that I have pressed my seam allowances toward the facing, I'm going to turn it over to where the right side is facing up, and we're going to insert a stitch right along the edge. Okay, now you're going to go to your pressing station and you're going to fold the facing to the inside and you're going to press that down. And when you fold it over, your seam should be at the top, right along the top, with just a bit of the dress peeking out over the top. Okay, next we're going to attach the front of the dress to the back of the dress. starting with the shoulder seam. But before you do that, you can go ahead and finish off your side seams. I finished mine off with a serge, and I did it individually on the front and the back. Okay, so we have our shoulder seam. We're going to pin that together, and I've pinned across the top, making sure that you match up your notches and that your raw edges are even. Next, I'm going to go over to where the facings are, and I want to make sure that my facings, after it's sewn together, I want to make sure that they're even right there. So I'm going to open out the facings on both sides, and I'm going to press those together and making sure that the folds are next to each other. I'm going to go ahead and pin that in place. Okay, and when I open it out, it should be even. So we're going to go to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch a 5/8 inch, and I'm going to start at the end here where the arm will go through at the armhole, and then sew all the way over to the shoulder seam. Okay, I'm going to be using my serger to sew my shoulder seams. If you don't have a serger, just use your regular sewing machine, and then you can finish off your edges with your method of choice. Okay, and then I'm going to go to the pressing station, and I'm going to press my seam toward the back of the dress. Okay, next we're going to sew the front and back of the dress together. So you're going to place your front and back with the right side spacing, lining up the raw edges together on the side, and you're going to sew from the bottom hem of the dress all the way up to where you inserted or where you traced the dot onto the side seam where the armhole ends, and you're going to back stitch, and then you will be done sewing the sides. Okay, the only thing left to do is to sew up the hem at the bottom of the dress and at the armholes. But I am going to warn and encourage you to please let your garment hang overnight and then try on your dress before hemming. I did not do that, and I'm paying for it. What you see me doing here is removing the stitches from the hem at the bottom because the dress is uneven at the sides. The side seams hang, or the side hangs a lot longer than the front and the back of the dress. And I've heard other people had issues with this too. So there has to be something with the pattern, or I don't know if it was designed that way. If it was, that's a thumbs down for me. So make sure that you try on your dress before hemming. So what I did was I put it on my dress form, and you see me here folding up the dress and pinning to make it even all the way around. And it wasn't so bad, but yes, you do see your girl wearing knee pads because I was not about to be down on the floor, on that hard tile floor on my bare knees. Love my knee pads. All right, so make sure you take care of your hems and you will be done. Okay, we are done with our dress, and this is what the front looks like at the midriff and the neckline. Now the only thing left to do is to go around and clean up all of the loose threads, remove any basting stitches that are showing, and give it one final press, and you are ready to wear your dress. Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you have enjoyed this sew along, please hit the like button. If you're not already subscribed to my YouTube channel and you would like to see more like this, then I invite you to get subscribed by hitting the subscribe box down below in the description box. And after you have done that, hit the little bell to the right of the subscription box so that you will be notified when new content is posted here to my YouTube channel. And I do have more coming. I have a list of sew alongs that I want to bring to you guys along with pattern reviews. some tutorials and other content that I'm going to start adding. I'm really looking forward to it. So happy to be back, and I'm happy to have you guys with me. So stay tuned, get subscribed, and as always, until next time, remember, when you live in your design, it is from there that God shines. That means when you live according to the way that you have been created, it is from that place that God will use you to bless other people. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.